So my name's Gudla Weiss-Sussex, and I teach and organize German studies, but also comparative studies here at the IMNR. Just by way of briefly introducing what we want to do here today. So of course, translingual studies, as Catherine was saying, translingual studies or translingual writing isn't anything new. You know, when you think about writers going into exile, you know, many of them were forced to write translingually, to change their language, write in a different language. And for many of them it was very difficult, because it meant not only to change their language, but to change their reading public, to change, you know, their audience. And, you know, many of them actually never quite managed to do that. I'm thinking of quite a few writers who had to emigrate from Germany into the US, for instance. Some became really big in the film industry, and some just couldn't really make that step. So it's nothing new, of course, but I think what we're seeing more and more now, and what maybe our focus is becoming more and more, is people who choose to write in a different language. And of course it's also very much tied up with migration backgrounds, but you know, now we see much more the phenomenon of people moving in order to find new opportunities. And that's why the slightly cheesy title of, you know, a new language, a new life. You know, this way of living in a different way, widening horizons beyond the monolingual paradigm. So writing with several languages, or heteroglossia, as some people like to call it, or multilingualism in writing, hybridity in texts, a long time has been seen somehow as defective in some way, or as not quite right, not quite correct. And I think, you know, our view of that has changed a lot, and we now are more aware of the opportunities and the possibilities that we have in translingual writing. And mainly, I'd like to sort of draw your attention to translingual writing as an expression of a particular community, particular tradition, or particular identity, which is defined and, you know, self-confidently defined as a hybrid identity. Or you often find translingual writing also as a kind of rejection of these identitarian categories, and a resistance to being pigeonholed in any way. I'm thinking, for instance, of Zafer Zenocsak. He's a Turkish writer writing in German, and he's come up with this language that he calls Kanak-Sprach. So it's Kanak is a very pejorative term in German, denoting Turkish people. So it's accepting that negative term and turning it into something. This is our language, yeah, kind of self-confidence expressed through translingualism. Anyway, today we're going to focus on three language contexts: German, French, and Italian. And you've probably seen from the program, I've deliberately mixed them up, because I think, you know, we do want to talk about specific examples and specific texts, but we want to move beyond that as well, and, you know, have the comparative dimension in there, and see whether there are any questions that span the languages, are any answers that we can find spanning the languages. So there are several questions we'd like to look at. One concerns the strategies and the techniques of translingual writing. Really the question, how are they enriching literature? And what can they do that monolingual writing cannot do? We'd also like to look at how translingual writing can create new contexts of thought, or even new structures of thinking. So what I'm thinking here of is moving beyond the boundaries of different languages, away from this kind of binary thinking of my language, your language, because actually if you think of languages as a hybrid concept, then this binary thinking doesn't make an awful lot of sense anymore. So expressing hybridity, but also when I mention new structures of thinking, I think there might be, we'll see if it's borne out in our texts, but there might be an argument for saying it's a different way of thinking, it's an associative kind of thinking, very often that is engendered by translingual writing, rather than the sort of logical thinking that follows one strand. If you hop between languages, if you create associations between languages, there might be a way of thinking differently that is engendered by this sort of writing. And finally, I think another important question for us is if translingual writing is self-consciously divergent from majority one monolingual writing, from hegemonic norms, then maybe we should investigate the link with other non-hegemonic groups and to see where the links are and what results from linking. So in this event we are focusing on women's writing, and there might be a very interesting way of looking at what happens when translingual writing and writing about gender, about femininity come together. Is there something that can work to create something new? These are my questions. I'm sure you all came with your own questions, so I think there'll be lots to talk about. We'll discuss and gather thoughts, and keep in mind also that this is meant to be a first little event, a sort of scoping event for a larger event next year. So anything you think about now, anything you find interesting, can feed in to what we're doing as a follow-up to this. Okay, I'll stop talking now. I'll just say a quick word about the program. Loredana Polezzi has unfortunately not been able to come. She's ill. So we only have 5 speakers. And we've decided to change the timing slightly. You've got the new program on your handout. So we'll take the first 3 talks together, have a discussion of the first 3 talks, and then have a cup of tea before we have our last 2 talks. So the first panel will be mixing up French, German and Italian, and we're starting with a Skyped-in talk because Mary Gallagher, who's giving this talk, is stuck in Dublin and there were no flights. So she's been beamed in. I can't see her anymore, but I hope that doesn't mean anything bad.
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Excellent. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay.
If we have the PowerPoint up in front, then we use her.
Oh, okay.
There she is.
There she is. Hi.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay. So I will move the PowerPoint while Mary speaks. I hope this will work. Tell me if it doesn't. So just by quick way of introduction, Mary Gallagher is Professor of French and Francophone Studies at University College Dublin. She's mainly a Caribbeanist, and she's an academic and a translator. She's just finished a translation of a Caribbean travel diary by Paul Moran. And she's now working on a book about the transnational writer Lafcadio Hearn, who spent 2 years in the French Caribbean in the late 1880s. And today, Mary is going to speak about Nancy Huston. Over to you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Bud, and I'm really, really, really happy to be able to speak, despite the fact that I am, as you said, stuck in Dublin. So, hello London. I can't see who's there, but I'm really looking forward to talking to you about Nancy Houston. So is the sound quality okay?
It's fine, yes.
Great. Because I've got a bit of feedback here, and I'll just ignore that. So maybe we could just look then at the first slide. And so you see I'm going to be talking about something actually way outside my comfort zone, because as a Caribbeanist I'm more used to talking really about the post-colonial translingual situation, which is not at all what I'll be talking about here today. So just to introduce Nancy Houston, giving you a few key biographical facts. The first point actually being the all-determining factor in Houston's life and work to date. The fact that her mother left her father and 3 children, one of them was in 1959, and Houston was 6 years of age.
Mary,
Yeah?
the sound quality just deteriorated a lot. Can you move closer to the, yeah, thank you.
Is this any better?
That's brilliant.
Brilliant, okay. So, I'll just go through then the main points. The father remarries when Nancy is 6. The family moves to New Hampshire in the US, away from Canada. Houston studies in the US at Sarah Lawrence College in Maine. She goes to Paris on a junior year abroad, works there with Roland Barthes, and never returns. She studies for her maîtrise at the École des Hautes Études. She gets involved with feminist study groups, and eventually she decides she's going to be a writer. Later on, she has 2 children with the Bulgarian immigrant British Sveta Todorov. She writes in French, and writes and writes and writes, and often translates her own work into English. She leaves Todorov in 2015 with Swiss painter Guy Oser. Todorov actually passed away last year. So we just move on to the second slide. This is the first of 4 slides, which I'm trying to give people an idea of what Nancy Houston's production, her literary production, like. So 4 slides, 1 per decade. There's a colour code. Blue for essays, green for more personal reflections in more indeterminate genre, red for prose fiction. You'll see there are 2 columns, and on the right-hand side, I've indicated Nancy Houston's self-translation into English. With one exception, her self-translated works were written in French first. So we move on to slide 3. So the exception to the writing in French first is novel, plain songs. We'll say a few more words about that later in the presentation. On this same slide, I'd just like to point to you Journal de la Création, which is in fact a diary of Nancy Houston's second pregnancy, interspersed with stories of literary, artistic double acts. Couples like F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example. On this same slide, the last 2 works of the 1990s, were produced in 1999 and published in 1999, will be at the centre of my paper. Moving on to slide 4. So this is her production of Naughties. And the first text, what I would point out special attention, Lamb stroke Limpo. This work features the English and French versions side by side in the same book. And in fact, it's a reflection from Samuel Beckett's book. Samuel Beckett, another great translingual writer working in English and French, and also an expatriate living in Paris. Moving on to slide 5 then. I'm not going to say anything about any specific work in this slide. But what I would say is that all 4 slides that you've seen point to Houston's extremely prolific transgenre bilingual stroke translingual productivity. So moving on to slide 6. So the two works that I'm going to speak about more specifically in this paper, one non-fiction, Norrperdu, which she translates herself as Losing North, Musings on Land, Tongue and Self, and then the work of fiction, Polyphonie, translated as Prodigy, a novella. I'd just like to point out in particular here the loss and the gain in the self-translated English subtitle. So, Norrperdu gained the subtitle, and Podige changes its subtitle from polyphony to a novella. This novella has 8 narrators, including the 3 central voices, the Russian grandmother, the French daughter, and the French granddaughter. I suppose the particularly central character here is Lara, who is both daughter and mother. The French daughter, both mother. Now my thesis is that at the heart of Houston's essentially translingual reaction to a mother absent from her early life lies a complicated, somewhat contradictory relation to survival. It's as a survivor of that foundational traumatic loss that Houston has staked absolutely her on a scriptural engagement in a surfeit of life that I'm calling French survie, or in English, supervival. Moving on to slide 7. So the title of the non-fictional 1999 collection, Norrperdu, Losing North, Reflections on Land, Tongue and Self, this title announces a loss of direction, a loss of orientation. However, the book is entirely saturated with statements of addition and multiplication rather than of loss or subtraction. Occasionally, though, the mother makes her entrance into Houston's discourse, and with that maternal reference, the definitive, all-determining Dea Abscondita event of 1959 floods the writer, bringing the focus right back on surviving rather than superviving. Slide 8. Houston distinguishes in Norrperdu between true and fake bilingualism. She argues that translinguals, or fake bilinguals, are distinguished by their experience or their choice of temporal between a before and an after. Unlike true bilinguals, they suffer lack of temporal stroke experiential depth, acquired or adopted language. So to put it in another way, Houston's lack of a French childhood, her lack of a French youth, means that her life in French is associated, according to herself, with a sense of diminished reality, diminished conviction, diminished continuity. A lack of, the last word there, the German word, the lack of Selbstverständlichkeit, something that can be understood very naturally and simply. So moving on then to the next slide, slide 9. This lack of reality, this deficit of conviction or consistency or continuity or self-evidence regarding what one has actually become, regarding the life that one is actually leading, the translingual expatriate, can best be expressed as a feeling that nothing, and certainly not one's belonging nor one's identity, goes without say anymore. So moving on then to slide 10. Since nothing goes without saying for the translingual, everything must be spelled out. This is a recipe, of course, for linguistic hyperproductivity, the writer's dream. Indeed, Houston makes the point quite explicitly in quote in this slide that the translingual writer's exacerbated awareness of language is extremely faithful to writing. Moving to slide 11. Still on the theme of the contradictory effects of translingual expatriation, Houston suggests that being able to move between multiple worldviews could have meant having, owning, or possessing none. No, really. And she notes the impossibility of owning an identity if what thoughts, fantasy, perceptions, positions, opinions, lifestyle are different in the two languages. So the second point on this slide would translate as, I would never have written that in the other language. The quote after that means, well, who are we then, if we don't have the same thoughts, fantasies, existential attitudes, or opinions in one language and in the other? So instead of being able to name one's identity or oneself even, all one has our question. Who am I in French? Who am I in English? Which is the real me? Moving on to slide 11. For Houston, the translingual expat overflows with selves and lives, identity and voice, translinguistic, transcultural, and transtemporal. These may be incompatible, contradictory, but do not cancel each other out. Only dementia effaces one's past self-perception, and Houston suggests that one's past self can even survive patriation. So on that slide, expats are rich with accumulated and contradictory identities. Monolingual non-exile, translingual monolingual non-exile are singular, whereas translingual expats separate self. Nous sommes deux, we're two, we're two plus each one of us is at least two, at least double. The next quote, we are all our ages at the same time. All the ages we've ever been, we are still the same. And then the last quote on that slide, we have the translingual expat has an existence here and also has one back there. Moving on then to slide 13. For Houston, it seems that this existential abundance or excess put the translingual expatriate at a cognitive or epistemological advantage. According to Houston, they know, better than monolinguals know, better than non-exiles know, that a given national or cultural or linguistic identity is the result of 1,000 contingencies, and that identity is fiction rather than fiction. Slide 14. Houston translinguals have an intimate connection with illusion or fiction. As the analogy between exile and theatre shows, as the first quote on the slide, Houston believes that the translingual expat to be constantly faking it, constantly performing a role, putting on an accent, consciously and even self-consciously studying for, rehearsing or imitating a part, learning their lines. What is noteworthy here is the use of physical imagery to suggest the effect on the psyche, I suppose, of this nth degree of linguistic, cultural consciousness effort. The strain is likened to torture. she actually uses the word just in English in the British text. It's also likened to difficulty of getting used to a new body. At the donner, pousser blanc, or getting used to a grafted body. Houston thus likened being translingual to feeling outside his own skin, alienated from full intimacy with one's own body, and unable to achieve real intimacy with the new language body. So, slide 15. Just going back to that idea of an exacerbated consciousness of language. For Houston, that exacerbates linguistic awareness that the translingual has, produces a constant intellectual stimulation, une stimulation intellectuelle de tous les instants. And she, in fact, evokes Beckett in this context. It's not present in the quote, but she does refer to Beckett. And more specifically, what she says is that Beckett illustrates the translingual redemption of language from the curse of the commonplace. Houston appears then to imply that while translingual writing is effortless and painless, this labour, this torture, is extremely productive. Furthermore, each language can actually appear to speak for itself, as well as allowing the speaker to speak in or through it. That's the last quote, so the writer can almost, translingual writer, is so hyper-conscious of how this language is working, either the old language or the new language, that they can almost anything they write seems to speak for itself. You know, that's the Heidegger idea, I suppose, that's the Sprache. Moving on though to slide 16. This point that I'm making now, language being almost productive in itself for the translingual, that picture is not quite as big as much here, because Houston is not prepared to let language, any language, speak in her place or drown out her voice. Moreover, as she recounts in Losing North, right from the start of her writing life, she dared herself to write fiction, side by side with her more intellectual writing, essays and studies. Remember, she worked with Paul Clark, and she published her thesis that she wrote with her on swear words in French. So she dared to write fiction as well. And she's suggesting in quote I have on this slide that it was because she craved a more immediate, more innocent, less self-conscious style of writing that although she started writing her fiction in French, she actually switched to English. And she switched to English in two ways. Firstly, by translating her French novel into English, but also by writing one novel, Plain Song. I mentioned this at the very start of the presentation. That novel she wrote correctly in English. This was a once-off, however, and she seems to explain why it was a once-off by claiming that it was in writing Plain Song that she discovered that, quote, my mother tongue didn't recognize me as her daughter anymore. So slide 17. For Houston, literary fiction exemplifies the writer's freedom to experiment with further selves and further lives. So I'll just do a rough translation of these quotes. Our freedom to go elsewhere, to be somebody else in our head, is absolutely hallucinatory. The novel, whether one is reading it or whether one's writing it, reminds us of this freedom. The freedom that we have not to be content with one identity, religious, national, sexual, or political, an identity conferred by birth or at birth. And then the second quote, literature authorizes us to push back the limits as much a matter of the imaginary limits as necessary or obligatory limits, those limits that trace out and define ourselves. And the novel is what celebrates this recognition of others in ourselves and of ourselves in others. That's what Houston says about it. So moving to slide 18, the self-translation. Houston has really translated both her own novel into English. The hyper-productivity, the trans-shock experimentation, the fiction, and the saturated self-reflexivity that we've noticed in Houston's production, I hope. This all testifies to a fascination with the sheer multiplicity of experiences, selves, lives, and voices that are particularly open to the translingual expatriate writer. And on this slide, we have statements that expose, in my view, that craving for a certain excess of life and of lives, a craving that Houston's literary creativity and indeed also her just in her own powers of procreation. And of course, crucially of all for us, translingualism all seem to feed. So the first quote there is absolutely unthinkable that we only have one love. And then the second quote, I really want to insist on this, I really want to emphasize this. During all the years after I left Alberta, there was another self who continued to live out there. And then the third group, all of us live out the different epochs or eras of our life in superimposition. They're all superimposed on one another. They're not all mixed up. They're not all blended or fused. There is that fuse unless one suffers from convention. That's what she said in that last. And I'm on my last slide, I use that here, number 19. So the first quote is from the back cover, Verb, which in turn is an extract from Houston's 2016 book of occasional writing. And in that quote, still explicitly claiming the right to speak with several voices. I'll just translate the quote. The text in her 2016 book, they complement each other, they contradict each other. And in that, they're faithful to Roman Gary, who was another translingual writer with multiple selves, who was my master in schizophrenia. I absolutely assert and take responsibility for the fact of having several voices, of being a self who speaks in several voices. So Houston there is still articulate that same bulimic, I think, appetite for self-multiplication and for supervival that she has explicitly linked in Losing North to the radically unmet need for maternal recognition, presence, and proximity when it really really mattered. And that's the second quote on this slide, which is taken from Losing Worth. And in this quote, Nancy Houston's saying is that all permutations of herself, of her work, and of her voice, all those multiple identities that she embraced and then rejected, pushed away, all of them were saying what? In the final analysis, they were saying, is that right, Mummy? Is that how you do it, Mummy? Is that how I'm meant to be, Mummy? So, second last slide then, slide 20. I think this is a really interesting quote again from the Nor. What is important is what is translatable. You know, people like Emily Hector would say the exact opposite, that what's important is what cannot be translated from one language into another. But no, Houston says what's important is what is translatable. I think self-translation into the mother, lost mother, the abandoning mother tongue, is a sort of voice test for Houston. It serves for her to confirm, to confirm the substance, the reality, the significance, the validity, the serenity of what one has lived, what has written, what has done. If it can't be written and communicated and remembered, if not for a month, then at least its mother tongue, because that is the language into which she translates herself, then did it happen? Is it real? If they can't be written of and if they can't be brought across the board, i.e. translated, then parts of the translingual expatriate life are lost, if they ever exist. Lost not just to others, but also to this life. So I think maybe gone on too long to, I have one more slide to comment on. Do I have time?
Yep.
Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so the last slide then, slide 21. I said that I was going to talk about a second text. This is the text I have written on, and it was difficult to kind of compress it down into something that would make sense. But it is a prodigy, a novella. So both Lara, a music teacher, and Maya, her daughter, were nurtured or raised by a mother alone, who were the Bob's more asked from her daughter's life. Maya, however, has two mothers, a not reconstructed Russian immigrant grandmother, Sophia, and she also has a mother, Lara, who presents as almost too perfectly French, Franco-Française in fact. But Lara's forced cultural identity breaks down completely when her child, Maya, born prematurely, nearly dies and is thrust into a prodigious life of effortless harmony by her mother's musical cocooning. Lara's strained and thriving musical life. She's a piano teacher who never feels to really have a proper connection with music. So Lara's strained and thriving musical life and her forced French identity dissolve when she is entirely subsumed into her maternal role. She's thereby released from the terrible burden of contingency and from the strain of knowing that she alone has chosen this arduous life. As a sort of failed musician, this constrained identity as a perfect French woman. When her daughter Maya then reveals herself as a musical prodigy, a complete natural, and thereby as more than a survivor, as a super-survivor, hyper-alive, Laura's work is done, and she collapses into a catatonic state of bare life, from which her daughter promises to rescue her as she had rescued her mother. So now my conclusion. I'm actually not going to have time to translate those quotes for you, but I want to conclude. If Houston the meaning and the value of the translingual mood, of that freedom to choose, and indeed of freedom to choose more generally. That these intersect in deeply complex ways. Not so much the idea of a new life, a different life, or an alternative life, as with the idea of multiple lives, multiple selves, exponentially multiple, which can sometimes, however, in the midst of over shimmering and shifting reality, vacillate and crumble, leaving exposed the vulnerability of a bare life, just barely surviving some shock, some realization of irreversible damage, loss, or absence. And I think really it's as though all that excess exists to suggest, to amplify some abandonment, some neglect, some mistake, or even just the inexorable human commonplaces that are the passage of time, human mortality, and the cold, hard reality that outside of language, we do only live once. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mary, for kicking off. And I think it's such a multi-layered and such a thoughtful talk. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But let's have our other papers at the same time so we can all discuss them together. So we'll go on directly to our second speaker, and I very cordially welcome Anne Fleig. Anne Fleig is Professor of German at the Institute of German and Dutch Philology at the Free University of Berlin. And she is heading a research project that focuses on German transnational contemporary literature and multilingualism. And I can now leave my... Yeah. I don't quite know how to do this.
Just minimize Mary so that she's not scared at myself.
Okay, thank you first for the introduction and for inviting me here. I'm looking very much forward to our discussion this afternoon and hope to your questions. This is a big step now from this paper to mine, but I hope we make it. The title is New Language and Female Voice, Heteroglossia in the Writings of Östermar and Tarada. In the past 25 years, we can find an increasing number of multilingual transnational text written by women writers with different backgrounds. This finding raises the question if writing in a new language offers a chance for women to become authors. This is to say, if writing in a new language allows them to articulate themselves in a specific way that is bound to multilingualism and heteroglossia. In what follows, I want to discuss that the difference between speech and written text might function as an entrance for women writers to get in the literary public. If we think of writing as a practice based on experience and everyday life, we have to keep in mind the existing gender hierarchies. For this reason, there has been a controversial discussion about, in German it is weibliche Ästhetik, I don't know if you, female aesthetics, is this a term of discussion? Yes. In the 1980s, which sets out to develop and articulate an alternative to the powerful normative standard in the literary field. the idea of a male author who is, as it were, in full command over the one language of monolingualism that is his language. In the last years, it has become obvious that there are several parallels between women writers and migrant writers, even if this is hardly ever discussed in German academia. What about the voice of the female migrant then? Focusing on transnational literature now, I want to stress that we can't think of multilingualism without thinking about monolingualism. The monolingual paradigm, as Yasmin Yildiz has called it, is today's norm, even if there are many examples of multilingualism. What I like to do in the next 20 minutes is to discuss that the concept of the monolingual paradigm and the mother tongue is highly gendered. I don't want to raise questions about enuthetics, but rather talk about this structuring gender bias within the monolingual framework. My paper has two parts. In the first section, I will go back to the rise of monolingualism around 1800 and its consequences with regard to the concept of the modern author and modern literature. Against this backdrop, multilingual texts often unfold a dialogical encounter between different languages and voices that also reflects on the differences within a certain ensemble of speech. With regard to Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, we can call this dialogic interaction in literary text heteroglossia. My thesis is that this polyphonic, dialogic form of interacting with language is not only a central feature of many multilingual literary texts, but also hints at a polyphony of gendered voices. In the second section, I want to discuss two German language examples in order to explore these questions. In the writings of Emine Östermann and Yoko Tawada, we can analyze two different modes of relating gender and heteroglossia by explicitly reflecting on monolingualism and the mother tongue. It is often that we are thinking of multilingualism as a new quality of transcultural literature today. However, we also have to think about the persistence of the monolingual framework as a genuinely modern phenomenon. The emergence of monolingualism dates back to late 18th century Europe. So historically speaking, it is monolingualism which is a fairly new phenomenon. As Yildiz has argued in her book Beyond the Mother Tongue, monolingualism established the idea that having one language was a natural norm. Especially German thinkers developed the concept of the mother tongue that stresses the unique and unchangeable origin of one's tongue and relates it to the modern nation-state, suggesting that the language of one's mother is also naturally the language of the state one belongs to. Yildiz analyzes the relationship between language and nation as an affective knot, since it operates on a level that does not deal with discrete meanings of speech acts, but rather structures the ways in which language can be used in the first place. The monolingual condition does not only affect the practices of subjectivation, it also influences practices of literary writing. As Yildiz points out, the uniqueness and exclusivity of language imagined as mother tongue lends it authority to an aesthetics of originality and authenticity. Looking back to literary discourse at the end of the 18th century, I would therefore like to stress that the historical formation of national languages is closely linked to modern literature. On the one hand, this holds true for the tradition of bourgeois drama and the German National Theatre, which both Östermar and Tavada refer to in their writing. On the other hand, and maybe even stronger, this holds true for the rise of the novel and the emergence of the modern author. Maybe there are differences between the English and the German tradition in this field of the novel. We could discuss this later. All these developments around 1800 lead to the primacy of the written text and cannot be separated from what we call today the monolingual paradigm. Most interestingly, these changes combine the notion of authenticity and the notion of standardization, which lead to the effective knot Yildiz is talking about. It is at this point that we have to think about gender and the monolingual condition of modern literature. The naturalization of monolingualism and the naturalization of Geschlechtseigenschaften, that might be translated as gender qualities, go hand in hand. In the binary discourse around 1800, the idea of spoken language emerging from the maternal body leads to the material quality of language to be formed in literary writing by the modern author and its male genius. This might sound a bit a cliché, but indeed it is in this regard that writing is especially important. Writing is both part of this highly normative discourse and a practice situated within. As Friedrich Kindler has shown, also speaking and reading are practices that tend to develop a universal norm and one fairly homogeneous German standard language. We can find this in the German word Mundart, which is dialect or the vernacular, but literally means art from mouth. While the mother is reading with her children, she is also working on standardization. Even more than that, writing and especially the printed word are driving the normalization of monolingualism. As David Gremling has shown, the book was thus becoming the medium or mediator of monolingualism. It is a printed text which makes the decisive difference compared, for instance, to the handwritten letter. The increased circulation of printed literary text brought about a model of authorship which is located within the literary public. This model, however, revolves around the idea of an autonomous male subject. Detached from the mother, this subject figures as the possessor of his mother tongue according to his original genius and authorizing his work by his name. With regard to the German-speaking world around 1800, entering the literary public by means of the printed word, therefore, has been very difficult for women, while it was indeed easier to participate in other forms of public literary life, such as theatre. The fascinating historical changes around 1800 are of course not my topic today, but we should remember that they are still impacting our present. In her acceptance speech for the Camisso Prize, Östermar reflects explicitly on the difference between speaking and writing. While her turn to German has never been a problem for her as an actress, it has been questioned again and again while acting as an author. Obviously, it is her writing that evokes these questions. What is important here is the difference between speech and monolingual literary writing. Against this difference, literary multilingualism reflects on multiple voices. These voices emerge from written text, reintroducing their bodily dimension in a dialogic interaction, a movement we can call heteroglossia. I will now turn to my second section and my first example. I have already mentioned her. This is the German author Emine Sevgi Östermar. Let me briefly introduce her. Östermar was born in Turkey in 1946. At the age of 18, she went to Germany for the first time. She worked as so-called guest worker in Berlin, earning money in order to go to acting school in Istanbul. At this time, she didn't know any German. After moving back and forth between the two countries for nearly a decade, she settled in Germany in the late 70s. She became an actress and later a writer. Today, she is quite well known as one of the first German writers with Turkish background. Östermar's literary oeuvre has won several important literary prizes, among them the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize, the Adalbert von Chamisso Prize, and the Kleist Prize. In Östermar's writing, we can find a close connection between multilingualism and gender. Many of her texts deal intensively with the question of language, especially those of moving between languages and its affective impact. In several texts, she reflects on the meaning of the mother tongue, which is also the title of her first publication from 1990. Mutterzunge. The German title is Mutterzunge. In Mutterzunge, the I narrator reflects on the loss of her mother tongue. The narrator claims that she doesn't know when this happened. She only remembers her mother talking to her. During this process, the mother tongue appears as foreign language. In this text, it is the narrator's mother who remarks that her Turkish has changed. There are somehow disruptions in her talk which underline the process of changing her language, going on word for word. This process is already reflected in the title of her publication. While in English as well as in Turkish, tongue means language and tongue. In German, these are two different words. Their combination in Mutterzunge hints at a new literary language that is based on multilingualism and heteroglossia. The same process is reflected in the way the narrator makes small artificial mistakes in German. Her text, Mutterzunge, mother tongue, begins like this. In meiner Sprache heißt Zunge Sprache. And this is about this double meaning. In my language, tongue, difficult to translate, means tongue and language. Zunge hat keine Knochen. Wohin man sie dreht, dreht sie sich dorthin. This means the tongue has no bones. Wherever one switch it, the tongue turns there. If one would strictly apply the rules of German grammar, the line Zunge hat keine Knochen, wohin man sie dreht, dreht sie sich dorthin is not entirely correct. However, its chiastic structure resembles and reiterates the turning of the tongue and performatively emphasizes a mimetic momentum of speech. The turn from Turkish to German is described as a move that basically involves the body. At first, speaking seems to be tightly linked to the mother. But as the tongue has no bones, it is easy to turn it and to carry it away, while the vernacular becomes part of memory. First and foremost, however, these small mistakes, as well as the memory of speech, refer to writing, the transition from speaking to writing, and thus to the development of Östermar as an author. While she strategically uses small alterations in many of her literary texts, she builds a new literary language for the I narrator in her texts that reflects on the difference between speech and writing, and within that difference undermines the notion of authenticity that is such an important aspect of modern authorship. This difference between speech and written text is also at the heart of her second story in this first publication, Mother Tongue, called Großvaterzunge, the tongue of the grandfather. While searching for her mother tongue, the narrator decides to take lessons in Arabic, the language of the Quran, but also the language of her grandfather. While they could talk in Turkish, her grandfather could not read it. The difference between Arabic and Turkish refers not only to the gender difference between speech and writing, but also to the national framework of monolingualism that has been established in Turkey since 1927. As I've shown in my first part, national language and modern literature are closely linked. In Großvaterzunge, grandfather's tongue, the protagonist falls in love with her language teacher, which seems to confirm the traditional gender bias of speaking and writing. But at the end of the story, she leaves him with an open, multilingual mind, looking for all kinds of words. The new language, in this story Arabic, also helps her to remember her mother tongue and to write about it in German. This process is described as a process of emancipation of a female voice that becomes a writer in moving between languages and between speaking and writing. At the very end of the story, this process is echoed by an unknown girl on the street, thus following a mimetic and performative poetics of speech. Let me turn then to my second example, the German-Japanese author Yoko Tawada, who is famous for her writing in both languages and both countries, where she received prestigious prizes, among them the Kamiso and the Kleist Prize. Tawada was born in Tokyo in 1960 and left Japan, like many women, for foreign language studies. She has been living in Germany since 1982, where she has studied German language and literature at the universities of Hamburg and Zurich. She holds a doctoral degree in German literature. Having published stories, novels, and poems, as well as plays and essays in both Japanese and German, Tawada frequently engages in questions concerning the encounter of different cultures and languages. Like Östermar, Tawada is reflecting on the double meaning of the word tongue in many different ways. Both authors reflect the national framework of the monolingual paradigm. Both highlight the difference between speech and writing and its bodily dimension. But while Östermar tries to rethink the concept of the mother tongue with regard to the narrator's mother and her memory, including the history of Turkey and the maternal vernacular, Tawada rejects it altogether. She criticizes the gendered and naturalized relations between nation and language, especially with regard to the idea of possessing one true language only, an idea that clearly dates back to 1800. In her publication Übersetzungen, Tawada reflects on the restrictions of monolingualism already in her experimental title. The title Übersetzungen is playing with the homonym and homophone meanings of translation, passage, oversee, and soul. It demonstrates that processes of translation not only open up unexpected meanings, but that they also could highlight differences in meaning on the basis of speaking and writing. Furthermore, it shows that there is not only one true meaning, as there are several tongues in different situations and countries. These tongues are not bound to a certain body or a certain speaker, rather they perform gender undermining the concept of one naturalized mother tongue. Tawada's essayistic stories show that gender is a question of grammar, opening even new ways of subjectivation. In Eine leere Flasche, An Empty Bottle, this is one of the stories in Übersetzung, the narrator reflects, for example, on the German word ich, I, that is unknown in Japanese. On the level of grammar, this word is gender neutral, while Japanese always needs a gender qualification. Therefore, it provides 4 different gender positions, 2 male and 2 female ones. Tawada's writing allows to look at Japanese from the vantage point of German and vice versa. The narrator operates as an observer with distance to its object. This distance opens a reflexive and dialogic encounter between subject and object, which is also given in playing with the double meaning of tongue. She works on a dissociation of language and body that could be read as a reversal of the mother tongue and its inherent gender norms. Standing outside the one and only language, she looks from the outside at its gender bias too. Tawada's observations are always playful, but not in a reductive sense. They question norms and hierarchies underlying the monolingual paradigm of literary writing. Tawada's writing unfolds heteroglossia as a possibility of a polyphonic and multilingual speech that cuts across different positions in speech, including gender positions. From the side of the other language, the narrator seems to queer the concept of the mother tongue while rejecting the mother and becoming the tongue herself. To come to a short conclusion, my aim was to raise questions about the gendered concept of the monolingual paradigm and its consequences for a female voice in multilingual writing. Taking the tongue as a starting point, I have discussed different examples for heteroglossia, including the difference between speech and writing. By contrast, the question of language and gender is situated in a national framework, leading to the priority of writing and the emergence of modern authorship since the 18th century. As I wanted to show, there are different examples for heteroglossia and the possibility of a female voice. To take gender norms within monolingualism into account does not automatically mean to praise and celebrate multilingualism in an uncritical way. Quite the contrary. As both Östermar and Tawada demonstrate in their writing, to go beyond monolingualism means to question or to cross it again and again. Both authors reflect the norm of monolingualism as gendered norms. Both rework the naturalization of gender in language underlying the concept of the mother tongue. While Östermar tries to historicize it, Tawada rather tries to queer it. Most interestingly, Östermar and Tawada are both aware of the difference between speech and writing. Östermar's narrator wants to find her lost mother tongue again and then invents it as a new language. Tawada's narrator tries to challenge the concept of the mother tongue by becoming the tongue herself. However, it is heteroglossia within multilingualism that allows for female voices, opening up a public which the speaker herself is part of. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. great. We've already worked on this idea of mother tongue and developed that from the first talk into this. So, great. We now welcome our third speaker, Maria Cristina Secchio. Do you have a presentation you need to put up? Oh, it's on there, is it?
Yeah, it's
It
on
wasn't
here.
present. Okay. So Maria Cristina is a lecturer in translation studies at the University of Hull. Her language background is Italian. She works in Italian. She was a research fellow here at the Institute 2 years ago, and she tells me that her project originated here at the Institute, which is always wonderful to hear. And she's working on the representation of motherhood in Italian post-colonial women's writing, and she's approaching this from a post-colonial studies and feminist point of view.
Yes, post-colonial feminist translation studies.
Right.
Yeah. I have a background in translation studies, and this is reflected also, yes, in this paper. Thank you very much, Oser. So good afternoon, everybody. So today, yes, we discussed the translingual nature of Nuvole sull'equatore agli italiani dimenticati, which means clouds over the equator, forgotten Italians, by Shirin Lanzanari Fazer. And this is post-colonial Italian language novel. So I will address in particular our last research question. So what more translingual writing can achieve than works by mother tongue authors? And I will do so by engaging with the work of post-colonial translation studies scholars Paul Bandia and Bill Ashcroft, who looked at the presence of former dominated languages in Anglophone and Francophone literary works as a form of resistance to the former colonizers' language and as an act of transformation. Within the Italophone literary context, Lanzanari Fazer is one of the most eloquent representatives of translingual writers, whose works have been analyzed extensively by Loredana Polezzi, Jennifer Jones, and Simone Brioni. Lanzanari Fazer has published and self-translated her works in Italian and English, which are two of the three languages, together with Somali, that she uses in her daily life. The coexistence of these three languages reflect her migrant existence. Born in Mogadishu, she moved as a young woman to Italy, which she left after more than 20 years to move to different countries around the world, including the UK, where she currently lives. As she has declared in an interview, all three languages play a vital role in her life. Whilst it is difficult and not necessarily productive to label one of these languages as her mother tongue, Lanzanari Fazer is definitely an example of translingual writers whose position between languages enabled them to challenge the limits of their own literary medium, to put in Stephen Cannon's words. So in this paper I will focus on the analysis of two passages that demonstrate one aspect which makes Nuvole sull'equatore translingual, namely the presence of Somali language in this novel, which, as I said earlier, is written mainly in Italian. As suggested by its subtitle, the novel is dedicated to the forgotten Italians, namely to mixed-race Italians whose rights were denied by the racial laws promulgated in 1936 during the Italian colonization. This in fact forbade interracial unions, and as a consequence mixed-race children were discriminated against. They were seen as biologically inferior and naturally inclined to prostitution, crime, violence, and depravity. The forgotten Italians are represented in Nuvole sull'equatore by the main protagonist Giulia, a mixed-race child born in Mogadishu of a Somali woman and an Italian soldier. Unlike most Italian colonialists, the father does recognize his mixed-race child, Giulia, whom, however, he abandons years later to return to Italy. Giulia's mother, Amina, decides then to take her to a Catholic boarding school for mixed-race girls run by Italian nuns to assure her primary education and to protect her from racial discrimination. Julia, like all other mixed-race children in the boarding school, is the victim of physical and psychological abuse from the nuns who think that as a daughter of sin, she should be redeemed and turned into an Italian-speaking and schooled Catholic girl. So, through the analysis of the two passages that I'm going to show, I will present the author's act of narration of the discrimination experienced by mixed-race children as the transfer of a distant, marginalized, and oral tradition discourse into a Western dominant written one, by bearing in mind that this transfer is informed by ideological concerns related to identity and resistance to colonial domination. So this leads me to associate the author's representation with translation, as Bandia has done in the case of Francophone and Anglophone in literary text, and it leads me to read the translingualism characterizing Nuvole sull'Equatore as an integral part of this very process of translation. Bandia notes that as a result of translingualism, readers of post-colonial novels are involved in a transition from one language to another. Similarly, Ashcroft points out that post-colonial writers are involved in a process of inner translation when writing in their second language, and as a consequence, their very language is transformed by the presence of the former colonized one. According to Ashcroft, in fact, transformation lies at the point of intersection between post-colonial writing and translation. Both scholars argue that post-colonial translingual writers constantly make former colonized languages visible to the reader who is fluent in the dominant language through devices or strategies, including in-text translations, paraphrases, glosses, explanations, glossaries, and untranslated words. The latter are a clear signifier of the fact that the language which actually informs the novel is another language. While Bandia refers to them simply as writing strategies, Ashcroft called them strategies of transformation because they transform, namely reshape the text written in the former colonizer's language. Both scholars point out that the use of these strategies represents the author's refusal to translate specific words or sentences into the dominant language, and that this refusal is a refusal to be subsidiary. So against this background, I will look at Ramzan Fazl's act of narration as a process of translation from Somali into Italian culture. And I will look at the presence of Somali words in Nuvole sull'Equatore, which make this novel translingual, as untranslated words signaling that the language which informs the novel is not Italian, but the dominated other Somali. I will show how the writing strategies used by the author to insert these Somali untranslated words can be associated with translation strategies, and I will endorse Ashcroft's idea that they result in a transformation of the text. So whilst the Somali's untranslated words embedded in the two passages that we'll analyze and throughout the novel are translated in a glossary, this is actually included at the end of the book. Since it is outside the text, the Italian reader therefore is free, and I would argue encouraged to ignore it, since going back and forth may disrupt the reading. The glossary can therefore be seen as a non-intrusive paratextual element, unlike phonons or in-text translations, which might suggest that Somali is independent of Italian. Both passages I will show focus on the representation of Dada, an old Somali woman who was Julia's nanny, whom I see as one of the characters who best allowed the author to make Somali culture visible and to subvert the unequal power relationship between former colonizer and colony. Colonized and colonizer. Dada, in fact, can be seen as a doubly colonized subject. After being raped by an Italian colonist, Italian culture represents for her not only the usurper of her homeland, but also the violator of her body. As we can see in this translingual passage, Sorry if it's a bit long, but yeah, it's only two. We are going to look at only two passages. Her resulting resistance to Italian culture is visible also at linguistic level. Here Dada is asked by Mina, Giulia's mother, to help to raise her future child, but she initially refuses by explaining that she has never worked as a maid. I will read it loud in Italian, but yeah, you can see my translation in English. I didn't use the author's self-translation into English because it was quite difficult, so it would have helped me to make my point, basically. Sciapo Marabo, io non ho mai fatto la paressa. Lo so che non hai mai lavorato presso le famiglie. Ci sono in giro tante ragazze giovani che cercano lavoro, ma io ho bisogno di qualcuno di cui possa veramente fidarmi. Amina cercava di essere persuasiva. Dada rimase silenziosa, fissando il pancione della donna. Amina seguì il suo sguardo e passandosi il palmo della mano aperto sul ventre disse con voce ferma: abito con un bianco e sono incinta di lui. Dada non disse nulla. Quando lei era giovane era già di vivere con un bianco. Questo era per lei il segno che i tempi stavano cambiando. Io per te, rispose con durezza, cercate un'altra persona. E poi, io non parlo neanche l'italiano. Dada, non c'è bisogno che lo parli. Io fra poco partorisco e vorrei una donna matura che si prenda cura del bambino. Inoltre ti prometto che non sarei trattata come una boiessa. Fatti aiutare da una tua parapoli, suggerì bruscamente Dada. Non ho nessuno, sono orfana. Dada non si aspettava quella risposta che la commosse. Improvvisamente si sentì solidale verso la giovane donna. Pensò all'ironia del destino, proprio a lei, che si era sempre rifiutata di andare a lavorare per i bianchi, doveva capitare questa situazione. Io provo a darti una mano per i primi mesi con il bambino fino a che non trovi qualcun altro. As we can see, Dada is initially reluctant to accede to Amina's request and even becomes indignant when she learns that the young woman is expecting an Italian colonialist baby. I would argue that her resistance to working for a partially Italian family is expressed at linguistic level when she uses Somali to say that she's not looking for a job, sciapo marabo, and that when she was young it was shameful, to live in Italian. Interestingly, the author includes these Somali untranslated words in the text in such a way that they are not necessarily comprehensible to Italian readers unless they constantly consult the glossary at the end of the book. Boyessa maid, it's a new handout. So Boyessa maid and parabo, relative instead, can be seen as inserted through a contextual translation, because what follows allows the reader to understand their meaning. In the first case, for example, Amina's answer, I know you have never worked as a maid, allows readers to realize that Boyessa means just that, maid. In the case of Parabo, instead, by explaining that she's an orphan, Amina reveals at least that this Somali word refers to a member of the family. Finally, the way in which the author inserts Chad and higher reminds us of the translation strategy of captioning, which consists of inventing the word in such a manner as to make the meaning virtually explicit. If you engage with Bandia's interpretation of untranslated words, in this case they can be seen as Dada's occasional refusal to be translated into the Italian dominant language. Her resistance to Italian culture is also confirmed by the use of the adverbs severely and abruptly, which qualify the way in which Dada answers Amina, an imperative she uses to order her to look for somebody else and to ask her family for help. Interestingly, Dada's resistance is not only expressed to Italians, but also to the Somali woman Amina. I would argue that this is one of the several examples throughout the novel which allow the author to show how the ambivalence of colonial relations is not limited to a simple binary opposition, colonizer, Italian colonizer, Somali colonized, but it's also internal to the post-colonial society itself, as shown by Dada's resistance to Amina, who, as a wife of a colonialist, is seen as a betrayer of her society. From this perspective, Ramzanali Fazl seems to endorse Bandia's point that, quote, the concept of resistance or unequal power relations is understood in terms of internal dynamics within post-colonial space, end of quote, and helps us to enrich our knowledge of Somali culture. Translingualism in this case disrupts the flow of the conversation and emphasizes not only Dada's resistance to the colonizer's culture, but also an internal conflict. Translingualism can also be read as a form of resistance in this second passage, where Julia visits Dada after leaving the public school. This conversation between the old woman and the mixed-race child reveals their close relationship. As we can see, in fact, Julia asks her former nanny a delicate question, which also shows how Dada represents for her a point of contact with Somali culture. Giulia continuò la conversazione con una domanda che fece sobbalzare la donna. Lei chiese infatti se era infibulata. Dada corrugò la fronte ed esclamò: "Auzu bilamina Shaitan Ajalim, che per te, ma che domande mi fai?" Giulia le raccontò dell'episodio che le era capitato mentre con le ragazze andava al fiume e domandò: "Quelle ragazzine sono infibulate, perché io non lo sono?" "Io per te, sei la figlia di un italiano, sei italiana, soltanto le bambine somale vengono infibulate. Dov'è mio padre?" Colta di nuovo di sorpresa, Dada non sapeva cosa risponderle. "Amica, sono tornata al villaggio quando voi siete partiti per Nairobi. Non so se lui è ancora lì." Giulia si tenne dentro tutti i suoi dubbi. Gli adulti non la facevano sentire diversa. Ciò che le dava fastidio era essere chiamata Dada dai bambini. So Dada is shocked by Julia's question about whether she has been infibulated or not, which she perceives as almost irreverent, and to which she reacts with so many religious expression, "Auzu bilamina Shaitan Ajarim," which means, "Oh God, take the devil away from us," more or less. On the one hand, this can be seen as Dada's unconscious attempt to protect herself and a practice often perceived as religious by Muslim women from Julia's impudence. On the other hand, however, it is interesting to note that this is not the only religious expression used by Dada throughout the narration. I would argue that these expressions signal Dada's strong religious identity, which leads me to see this character as a symbol of resistance also to Catholicism, as confirmed by her anger represented elsewhere in the novel at Italian nuns who mistreated Julia. Making the Muslim religion visible through Somali language instead of translating religious expressions into Italian can be seen as a form of linguistic resistance to Catholicism, which, as also pointed out by Brioni, has often been used in colonies to justify biological racism. Later in the passage, after initially being indignant by Julia's question, Dada addresses her as Gebertei, darling, which she uses both when she asks Julia the reason for her question and when she explains that she cannot be infibulated because she's Italian. While this Somali untranslated word can be interpreted as operating at an affective level, interestingly, it literally means daughter, I would suggest that it also stresses the cultural difference between Dada, an old woman representing Somali tradition, and Julia, an Italian man's daughter. Aniga, instead, which means I, seems to convey Dada's determination in asserting her identity as a Somali woman, and in disassociating herself from Guido, Julia's Italian father, about whom she clarifies that she doesn't know anything. The resistance to the former Italian colonizer, however, is not the only one to be emphasized by the use of Somali language, which, as in the previous passage, also highlights an internal conflict. In this case, between mixed-race Julia and her Somali black peers, who see her as a girl, white. Whilst the author here is simply reporting the exact term used by the Somali community to refer to white people, the resulting translingualism can also emphasize that internal conflict in the post-colonial society. In conclusion, to answer our seminar research question concerning what more translingual writing can achieve than works by mother tongue authors, in Anzanani Fazil's case, translingualism seems to confirm Ashcroft's idea that it represents the translation of the languages of resistance with their multiple voices and representations. By denouncing, among other things, the effects of racial laws in Italian, the author seems to confront her Italian readers with a period of Italian history which is often forgotten. Yet, She subverts the former Italian colonizers' language through the use of Somali untranslated words by transforming her text and making it translingual. Through translingualism, the author makes Somali culture visible and resists the hegemony implied in homogeneous linguistic representations. As we have seen, the reading of a translingual discourse mirrors the procedures of translation. Italian readers, in fact, are not only confronted with the representation of the Italian colonial past, but they are also involved in a movement from Italian to Somali language. From this perspective, I endorse Pandel's idea that cultural representation is in essence an act of translation. Through translingualism, the author also challenges the notion of a national language and transforms a dominant discourse into a terrain for intervention. Her writing strategies, in fact, can be seen as translation strategies through which she intervenes in the text by confronting her Italian readers with unknown Somali untranslated words. Our author, however, also offers Italian readers the opportunity of a deeper understanding of Somalia as a post-colonial society by representing, for example, the internal tension between the Somali black community and mixed-race people, and this is also emphasized by translingualism. Resistance, therefore, is represented in both cases at a content and at a language level. Translingualism, in fact, includes elements contesting the authority of the former colonial language by disrupting the flow of the narration. To conclude, Ramzanani Fazl's translingual narration can be seen as a form of what Bandia termed as reparation, in the sense that it makes Somali culture visible and readdresses unequal power relations between former colonizer and colonized. Thank you.
Well, I think we can continue. It's my pleasure, even if it's probably not necessary, to introduce Gudula by Sussex. She is a reader in modern German literature at the Institute of Modern Languages Research and a fellow in German at King's College in Cambridge. She is co-director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing at the Institute for Modern Language Research. Her main research interests lie in the culture and literature of the 20th and 21st centuries in the following areas: women's writing, the works of German Jewish writers, modernism, the city literature and the liberal arts, biology and literature. Her current research projects focus on German Jewish women's writing in the 20th and 21st centuries as minor literature, minor, minority and small literatures in Europe, and translingual writing. I think we are at the core of all your interests.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
It's yours.
Thank you. Now, I'm really tall, so I think I can sit. Is that all right? Okay. So I'm talking about Katya Petrovskaya. And Katya Petrovskaya was born in 1970 in Kiev, in the Ukraine, which was then part of Soviet Russia. I'll move a bit. Her first language is Russian, though of course Ukrainian was widely spoken in Kiev, and also through her Polish family background she had a few fragments of Polish as well. She started learning German in the mid-1990s, and then in 2013 won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize, which is one of the main literary prizes in Germany. And she won it for a short text, which is now one of the core elements of her first and so far only book, entitled Vielleicht Esther. It's come out in English translation as Maybe Esther in January this year. And I haven't seen it yet, but I very much look forward to looking at that. Vielleicht Esther is neither a novel nor a memoir, though both fiction and memory play an important role. Rather, it is perhaps best described as the search for and coming to terms with family narrative and history. The book is an ethical undertaking in the sense of taking on, and I quote Marianne Hirsch here, in the sense of taking on the guardianship of a traumatic, personal and generational past, as Hirsch describes post-memory narratives, i.e. narratives that transport the memories of previous generations. But it is also more than that. Petrovskaya goes beyond the personal, genealogical relationships towards reflections on the transmission and translation of experience and memory per se, so beyond nation, beyond boundaries of family or even nation. In this paper, I shall explore how the handling of post-memory narrative and the translingual author's sensitivity to the pitfalls and associative possibilities of language combine to establish a concept of belonging that goes beyond traditional ideologies of identity as bound to a Heimat or home that is rooted in the place of origin. What is immediately striking about the book is that, tracing her own journey into her family history in the voice of a first-person narrator, Petrovskaya presents and accommodates a narrative with multiple strands, reflects, sounds out, and ultimately embraces incoherencies and contradictions. The prime example of this is the story of the, I forgot to ask someone, is it a ficus or a ficus? So it's this little plant, a little fig tree. Do you call it ficus? Ficus, thank you. So the story of the ficus plant that may or may not have played a crucial role in the family history. Preparing to flee Kiev before the invasion of the German army in August 41, a truck is loaded with the family's most needed possessions. A ficus plant in its tub that had been placed on the truck in the confusion is unloaded again at the last minute in order to make room for the boy who was to grow up to become the narrator's father. Having been told this story in her childhood, the narrator has always concluded, "Diesem Ficus verdanke ich mein Leben." I owe my life to this ficus. However, when the father eventually comes to write down his memories of the evacuation, he doesn't mention the ficus at all, and when asked about it, doesn't even remember its existence. After her initial shock at the recognition that this founding myth of her existence is not a shared memory, the narrator comes to accept the plurality of memories and still retains her view of the ficus as the main protagonist of the family narrative, which is woven together from different perspectives. Rather than discounting or discarding what Michael Rothberg terms competitive memories and insisting on one version, one truthfulness, Petrovskaya presents and accepts a polyphony of memories formed through a plurality of consciousnesses and varying with time and with each telling. Added to this acceptance of a plurality of memories and connected with it is the understanding of fiction as a complementary and indeed at times superior element in the construction of the family narrative. Oops. Hold on. Oh dear. Sorry. I'm back there. Okay. So, fiction as an important element. Sometimes it is precisely the pinch of fiction that makes a memory truthful, the narrator's father ruminates. He gives this Aristotelian concept of narrative probability precedence over mere facts, as it yields more than a meticulous stock-taking, mehr als eine penibel geführte Bestandsaufnahme. Misremembered facts give insight into the person's mind, and fiction is thus, to use Aristotle's words, more philosophical than history. In an absurdist somersault, mixing fact and fiction, the narrator concludes, es könnte sich herausstellen, dass wir unser Leben einer Fiktion verdanken. Thus, emphasizing the character of her narrative as a tale of possibilities and contingencies. Narrative, Petrovskaya shows, is a powerful tool for the generation that was born too late to have any first-hand memories. It is the only way to keeping memories alive, passing them on. But its function is also to continue to develop and evolve the family story. For as Marianne Hirsch points out, the cognitive activity of the listener is, I quote, imaginative investment, projection, and creation. So having listened, the members of the post-memory generation create their own narratives. Petrovskaya's story of the ficus exemplifies this, but we see it even more clearly in her telling of the fate of her grandmother, whose name was, maybe, Esther. Vielleicht Esther, as the narrator keeps calling her to draw attention to the unreliability and the fragmentary nature of memory, had been left behind in Kiev in 1941 after the departure of the rest of the family. She followed an appeal to all Jews in the city to assemble at the ravine of Babi Yar and was shot along thousands of other Jewish inhabitants of the city. In the absence of witnesses and testimonies to this event, the narrator imagines her grandmother's fateful last walk, bringing details to life, providing possible explanations, and drawing out the affective power of the narrative, inviting the reader's empathy and active engagement. Esther went to join them, she writes, but how long did this went take? Here everyone must follow their own breath. Petrovskaya doesn't just use language, she questions it and refuses to accept the glib use of words that hide more than they reveal, as in the case of went here, and thus stops the reader in their tracks. And she goes further. With the metalinguistic awareness that is so characteristic of translingual writers, Petrovskaya probes language, creating an effect of alienation, of making the world unfamiliar. Her use of the location name Oświęcim, for instance, instead of Auschwitz, conveys her resistance to cliché and the formulaic. On a much smaller scale, her probing of the word Glück or luck in the context of Holocaust research evocatively differentiates the data search from the empathic remembrance. Sie haben Glück, you are lucky, the archivist in the Jewish Genealogy and Heritage Center in Warsaw says, having found a photo of her family's house in the Warsaw Ghetto before the city's destruction in the war. But what kind of luck is this, she asks back, thinking of her family's fate as part of the murdered thousands in Warsaw. Most importantly, though, Petrovskaya's metalinguistic awareness opens the way to a whole new way of thinking, that of associative connections rather than of rational linearity. Thinking that allows for new connections and perspectives, for contingencies rather than fact-based truth, and thinking that is appropriate for piecing together a multi-perspective puzzle rather than following a one-strand narrative. Here's one example of how translingual word associations provide new perspectives. Polen, Polin, Polonia, Polania, Paulania, here lives God, 3 words in Hebrew that turn Slavic Poland into the promised land of the Jews. So here homophones or near homophones are allocated new meaning through a process of rereading bilingually, that's a term by Yasemin Yildiz, or listening bilingually, for the basis is of course the phonetic shape of the word. By thus traversing linguistic boundaries, defunctionalizing language, accidental connections are made or discovered, which may be leading to new insights or to the expression of new affective and intellectual connections. These connections can be playful, but they can also provide access to trauma, such as when in a nightmarish, half-awake stream of consciousness sequence after a performative casting for a film on the Warsaw Ghetto, the narrator feels the words schau and scheu, in English to show and shy, sliding into the Hebrew shoah. But the translingual language use also contributes to the multi-perspective view of the world in a wider sense. As Stephen Kellman puts it, translingualism makes it possible to simultaneously view the incompatible perspectives of an MC Escher visual puzzle. The process of translation is key to understanding the other and their viewpoints. When the narrator describes her Ukrainian father's mourning for Poland as a process of translation, for instance, language becomes a metaphor for affective experience, and multilingualism enables transnational empathy. Obversely, mistranslation destroys the truth and denies the subject humane treatment, when Jeguda is mistranslated as Judas, and the hapless bearer of the name pilloried in the press before being condemned to death as a traitor without a fair hearing. Petrovskaya's multi-perspective approach extends to her view of identity concepts as multiple or hybrid. When she describes her narrator's identity as motion in the gap between languages, in the exchange, the mix-up of roles and perspectives, she is careful not to get carried away with an unthinking, celebratory attitude towards the migrant identity. Indeed, she describes the ambivalence of the in-between, the oscillation between being lost and being free, with great honesty. Predominant, however, is the sense of a self-determined freedom and a pluralistic perspective that comes with a lack of rootedness. The narrator's family, which is spread across the Ukraine, Poland, and Austria, is rooted not in place, but in their professions and endeavors. Petrovskaya constructs an image of her family in free movement. They fly towards tomorrow, parallel with time and space, sometimes across it, following their own trajectory and the wise and stern books that we will never understand. It is hard to think, or hard not to think, of the associative images by Marc Chagall, the painter of East European Jewry, as a people following their spiritual and literary heritage and not aligned with space and time. The reference point for the family identity is that of learning, books, words, language. She defines her family as those impelled by language, die Sprachgetriebenen. Indeed, for generations, the narrator's ancestors have worked as teachers for deaf-mute children, so hers is a genealogy of providers of a voice to others, while experiencing problems of speaking for themselves. The narrator, who feels the loss of not having been told about her Jewish history in her youth, sees her exploration and telling of the family history as alignment with family lineage. She sees herself as offspring of the warriors against deafness. And playing on the double meaning of the word taube, which means in English both deaf and dull, she describes her writing as an attempt to make the deaf stories flutter and come to life. There's another instance here of a creative, powerful image being created through translingual, not translingual, but through a homonym. But why write in German? The choice of writing this narrative in the medium of the German language in particular is significant for Petrovskaya's construction of belonging. For not writing this book, in which the Second World War looms so large, not writing this book in Russian, is to avoid the Russian hegemonic nationalistic discourse in which Russians emerge as victors only, with no room for guilt towards oppressed ethnic minorities or oppositional groups, Jews, for instance, or prisoners of war. Petrovskaya's choice to write in German, in the language of the enemy, is to resist and to complicate the picture, for it is a step too to overcoming the dichotomy of perpetrators and victims, and to creating a common history of suffering. She calls it a shared antiquity, eine gemeinsame Antike. What stands out very starkly here is the difference between the situation of the Russian Jewish writer, Petrovskaya, and that of many post-war German Jewish writers who struggled with German as the language of the perpetrators and as indication of their problematic part-German identity. For Petrovskaya, by contrast, the choice of German implies an indication of freedom. We'll come back to this. freedom, distance, and, like for other translingual writers who were born in oppressive political regimes and chose to write in German, Herta Müller, for instance, a Romanian-born writer, or Emine Sefke Östermar, German is an oppositional language rather than an oppressive majority language. Indeed, in contrast to Russian, the German language is connoted with innocence for Petrovskaya. She says, the German language is a means for me to be a child again, to look at things with an innocent gaze, to not accept violence. She's echoing a point here that has been made by many translingual writers. Julia Kristeva, for instance, has remarked that for her, I quote, the new language is a pretext for rebirth, new identity, new hope. Petrovskaya seems to agree with this when she writes, my German, the language of the enemy, was a way out, a second life, a love that cannot fade because it will never quite be fulfilled. But in keeping with her resistance to linearity and the logic of singularity that I pointed to earlier, writing in the new language is for her not a sign of a new single identity, but rather it's a conscious choice of expressing herself as a stranger and of indicating a sense of hybridity and balance between a number of identitarian facets. On her brother's learning of Hebrew and her own German, she comments, through these languages, my brother and I created a counterweight to our origin. Embracing hybridity in this way, so not the adoption of a new identity, but the addition of a new identity facet through the acquisition of a new language, paves the way towards the narrator's sense of cosmopolitan and indeed universal connectedness. Petrovskaya's narrator does reference her regional and national belonging. She speaks of Kiev as meine Stadt, my city, and uses bei uns, in my country, to indicate in the Ukraine. But she recalls how from childhood on she has been aware of a wider sense of belonging, namely to Europe. She speaks of the diaspora Jews as last Europeans. And her reasoning is, schließlich haben sie alles gelesen, was Europa ausmacht. So belonging is again based on books, the transmission of culture through speaking and writing, and thus links up with the idea of the Sprachgetriebenen, those impelled by language. Beyond the European affiliation, however, language, words, in this case a family name, also provide access to this sense of connectedness. Exploring the semantic possibilities inherent in the name of one of her family branches, Stern, star, she links it to the 5-pointed star of the Soviet Union and the 6-pointed star of David, and finally expands its meaning even wider. To me, every star seemed to be a secret relative, including the stars in the sky. This expression of universal belonging clearly has an ethical dimension. Thus, on a visit to the concentration camp Mauthausen, Petrovskaya's narrator points out the acuity of the place's history for our world today, stretching its significance spatially and temporally. I am not being catapulted into the past. It is happening now. When, where, and to whom it happens is immaterial. She is urging, in other words, the interaction of different historical memories that Michael Rothberg has termed multi-directional memory. Rothberg defines this practice as a productive intercultural dynamic that sees memory discourses as, I quote, ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, allowing Holocaust memory to interact with and raise consciousness of the memory of other genocides and persecution elsewhere. There is an emphasis here on the fluidity of space and time, and on the exchange of perspectives that engenders inclusiveness. If we follow Gisela Ecker's definition of Heimat as constitution of identity that relies on exclusion, eine Stiftung von Identität, die Ausschlüsse vornimmt, the incompatibility of the Heimat concept with Petrovskaya's stance is evident. Rather than the absence of conflict, It is precisely the interest in the contradictions and gaps and in the meaning that results from these that characterizes her narrative. Her idea of identity and belonging is based on commonality, not on exclusion or selection of any kind. At the very start of her project, she explains, "The members of my family are indistinguishable from hundreds of others who bear the same name. It would be impossible for me to separate my family from strangers like wheat from the chaff. It would have been a selection, and I didn't want any." This translingual author, who rejects the language and rhetoric with which she was raised, Russian, and instead opts for a voice that she has described as slightly defective or disturbed and not quite functioning, das leicht gestörte, nicht funktionierende, a voice that questions, tests and tastes, and is thus singularly appropriate for showing up fault lines and dissonances in narratives that are too smooth and thus smooth over and hide more than they reveal. This translingual author stands in a minoritarian tradition of Jewish writing in German, one that disturbs any systems of identitarian definition that strive towards homogeneity and/or hegemony. In an article published 11 years ago, entitled Trotz und Triumph, Defiance or Triumph, Andreas Kirche distinguished two patterns or stances amongst contemporary German Jewish authors. Firstly, that of emigrating and freeing oneself from the negative symbiosis of Jews and Germans in Germany, in order to live a natural Jewish life with no need for justification or explanation. And secondly, the pattern of staying in Germany in order to work with the dissonances of the current situation. Kircher was then, in 2007, wondering whether the young authors among the East Europeans coming to live in Germany would live and write within those two patterns, or whether a third, entirely different pattern of German Jewish writing might emerge that would yield new perspectives through the gaze from the outside. With Vielleicht Esther, Katja Petrovskaya has presented exactly that. A literature that goes beyond Trotz und Triumph as it develops outside of a however constituted negative symbiosis.
Thank you very much. We didn't discuss if we should have a discussion now or if we have the second.
I think it's probably best to have them together.
Okay.
And there's actually quite a lot of crossover.
Good.
Surprisingly,
Good.
but I'm surprised. Well, I have certainly a sense of crossover. I'm also very tall, so I'm also going to sit there. I'm also going to be on the screen, so that's not the crossover that I was meaning, however.
Okay.
Let me just pull up this PowerPoint.
Okay, and I will briefly introduce you. Our next speaker is Anna-Louise Mill. She is Director of Research at University of London Institute in Paris, where she heads up the Paris Center for Migrant Writing and Expression. She has worked on literary review publishing in Paris and its connections to expatriate and refugee communities in Paris, as well as on Parisian cultural history more broadly. She also writes non-academic prose in French, one example of which is 75, a non-fictional novel published in 2016 with Gallimard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, so, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about my own writing, but from within an academic perspective as well. So, plural subjectivities or writing with, and the notion of the translingual to start. Translingual, so through or across languages, where the prefix trans points towards prepositions of movement. My choice of with as a preposition suggests perhaps a greater degree of stasis or a constancy. The with that I'm interested in has at some level to be what remains while other things change. It is a preposition of preservation, of keeping, not of abandonment. So does this matter for our conception of translingual writing? I'm going to attempt in what follows to keep grounding my thinking in the questions that Godila set up for this workshop. I'm the last speaker, and I think it's good to come back to the first questions. So, and I think they're good questions, and all of them speak to me at some level, but I don't think I'm going to answer any of them very directly. I'm not going to answer them directly precisely because they speak to me very directly. I'm called by them to speak to them from within a choice, my own choice, to write in a self-consciously literary way in a non-native tongue. That decision seems to require a justification or an explanation, so part of me wants to start explaining in response to these questions. And I'm susceptible to the charge of overstepping the mark, of misplaced ambition, should we say, beyond both my nativeness, my English, and my acquired academic competency in other languages. And this possibility of misplaced ambition makes me bristle with rationales and provisos, none of which ultimately hold much interest to anybody else, and really not that much to myself either. So let's say that I'm going to try and work with these questions rather than respond to them as a writer, though in that disposition there is no forsaking of my writing, for it's here on the table with me, it will be in the presentation. And I also think it's important to sort of stress that I don't think this sort of occasion should call for me to retreat to the ground of the Anglophone Academy. So instead, I'm going to invoke briefly Beatrice Spivak, whose work will run subterraneously through this, and she's present in the abstract that I submitted. So to answer her own characterization of the space of acquisition of the native language, not as a mother tongue, but as happening at the mother's knee. And I'm going to answer that at some level with her as well, her Spivak's description of the field of work as a broken and uneven place. So that comes from the Critique of Post-Colonial Region. Okay? I'm not looking in my own field of work for a cohesiveness, whether of purpose or of expression. And this too is why the preposition with is appealing to me. So, did I decide to write to no particular or prescribed end in a language I learnt, initially at least, in a modern comprehensive school in Scotland, because I didn't want to translate the words of the informants who were part of the impotence for writing to no particular end in the first place? This is a question I addressed to myself, but I don't have the answer. Perhaps there was some sort of reasoning like that. I knew I wanted to hear something that I found difficult in my interactions with the people I might call my informants. Perhaps I should even call them my native informants if I want to write with Spivak. But I was also, I suspect, working on a quite deeply inscribed tendency to think that hearing happens best, for me in any case, through reading, at least through a certain sort of reading. So an idea of what literature enables was definitely at play, and a particular sort of literature, resistant, desirable, self-conscious. Literature that required work, my work. And if it is true that this literature is often, for me, written in French, that is far from being always the case. And given that we have an interest here in the sort of bilateral relations between different languages, it's probably significant to stress that where this desiring of literature is concerned, I am quite generally enthralled. I'm susceptible to the intrigue of German sentences, for example. I'm alive in a very incomprehending way to Arabic, and I'm tied up in all sorts of complexities, conditioned in part, no doubt, by growing up in Scotland, in my relation to English. So if I try and schematize for a moment, I think I'm setting up a sort of choice for a non-native language, both as a question of veracity, or of authenticity, as we've said today. That is a sort of refusal of translation, a desire to use the languages of others. And at the same time, I'm setting it up, I think, as a question about the possibilities of distanciation, or the self-consciousness of a literary endeavour. That is, the desire for a resistant text. There is a sort of contradiction there, an apparent contradiction, but I think it probably only arises from the attempt to schematize. In the meantime, I have allowed myself to sideline, for the time being at least, questions arising from the difference between particular languages, i.e. questions of asymmetry that might, for example, characterize the way we would think about the literary market. And that was the first question, okay? Where opportunities that might arise from the choice of working in dominant languages, okay? And those dominant languages might prompt certain decisions about writing. Perhaps it's no doubt true that I can only speak and write from within the privilege of my first world languages, and equally from the choices made possible by a full-time academic job, which means that the writing I'm talking about does not have to have an eye directly on book sales. But I still want to contend that this writing from within that conditioning has some sort of relation to languages operating in spaces of exclusion. Exclusion from dominant media, from structures of economic opportunity, and even from very basic civil rights. Indeed, this will be my primary aim, to think the width of my title across these sorts of distances, and not as an in, as in French, premised on an out or a decision to forsake a native language. Anecdotally, in some of the instances I'm going to draw on, the language that I write with is English, just as it is also Arabic, Banjuni, Amharic, and French. So no new beginning, exactly, no new life, but equally no requirement demanded by the literary market, though in other instances, and perhaps in other tones, I'd say with no hesitation that it is an immense exhilaration to be able to hold apart from oneself a text chiseled into solid sentences and gradually aligned to hold together, to hold up to a form of scrutiny, so as to offer, as it promised it would at the outset of that particular book, something like a scaffolding for life in this world where I found myself living. A new perspective then, yes, if not a new life, and one that inevitably starts to gauge terrain not previously envisaged or perhaps even imagined, through such factors as durability, reputation, extension, reception, and so on. So the first of the questions that Gordon offered us for this workshop about literary markets, it's not going to go away. And I wouldn't want it to go away. But I'm still going to hold it, let's say, to the side of the field of work that I'm trying to mark out. And I'm struck that, in fact, we really haven't dealt, I don't think, with that question at all this afternoon. Okay, so what is then this field, the perimeter of this field? I'll put down 3 stakes, which I think I can define as space rather than a vector, such as the prefix trans might invite. 1, that the hearing I wanted to do was an impossible task. 2, that literature appeals to me as a name for processes that hold me in the ambit of that impossibility, while they also offer me some means of acting with it. And 3, that I have little sense that these processes make any difference in tangible gains in life possibilities, but not engaging with them would seem nonetheless to be a disaster. Perhaps that makes 4 stakes, not 3. This enumeration is a little spurious. It's not very clear where it stops and starts, and it could probably go on. There is quite a lot at stake in these processes for me, so I could keep putting stakes down. But its interest, this enumeration, the interest of an enumeration, is that it places us before and between a number of particular concerns, not straddling a journey between an origin and an elsewhere, or a mother and motherhood, for example. And it takes me towards a resource that I want to draw on from Derrida's discussion of a sentence that Montaigne attributes to Aristotle and which gave rise to his own text, La politique de l'amitié, or the politics of friendship. So in this text, Derrida seeks to think friendship, or the proximity of a comrade in English, beyond fraternity, beyond consanguinity, and beyond the family. For Derrida, small numbers, that is, the necessity of only a few concerns, only a few stakes, ones that you can count, or only a few friends, is axiomatic. Yet, so is the fact that democracy cannot be the preserve of the few. He says there is no numerus clausus for arrivants. We cannot, if we're interested in cultures and languages that move, go on with a regime that closes its doors to arrivants, okay, new arrivals. My concerns then, necessarily, what's at stake for me, is necessarily limited. The space that I have defined with my stakes will not have a great scope, and it is at some level about my writing. And yet at the same time, I do want this to be about writing in general. And there's no end to this contradiction, and each instantiation remains provisional. I'm not sure then, to come back once more to Godeler's question, that there's a new identity to be found in this process. And once more, I want to insist on halting before the move into a new language, to prefer that preposition with, which is also the preposition of amitié, for Derrida, of friendship. He says, and it's on the screen here, one must prefer certain friends. The choice of this preference reintroduces number and calculation into the multiplicity of incalculable singularities, where it would have been preferable not to reckon with friends as one counts and reckons with things. So the arithmetic consideration, the terrible necessity of reckoning with the plurality of friends, still depends on temporality, on the time of friendship. One must not have too many friends, for there is not enough time to put them to the test of living with each one. For one must live with each him, with each her. Is that possible? Living, this is understood with. Now, I think all of these statements can be made about languages too, as can the terrible need in democracy to choose our languages, or to work with the languages we have. For there is no democracy without a reciprocal and sustaining community of languages, speaking to one another, perhaps through translation. Yet there is also no democracy without universal respect for the irreducible difference of languages. The difficulty is that we do not have time to write or hear with all of them, or to translate universally. So what do we do in the face of that limitation? This question is an almost daily and concrete matter for me in the past few years, and remains so perhaps more intensely than ever today, living in an area of Paris that has long been a space of initial arrival in the city, right from the medieval era, and is today the hub of a massive range of actions and situations reflecting the dense presence of refugees and other displaced people, led at some level by the city authorities, supplemented and reoriented by a whole range of civil society efforts, and perhaps most importantly, appropriated by the recent arrivants themselves as spaces of commerce, work, sociability, and survival. The pressure to understand what is happening in these spaces of what the current jargon calls super high diversity struck me and continues to strike me as existential, political, and intellectual. And it seemed I might respond best to them by holding all of these pressures together, compacting them, even if this meant abandoning some of the clarity of demarcated fields of such as life versus academic endeavour, or more precisely fields of particular expertise, urban sociology versus translation studies, and English versus French versus other languages. So in this compacting, there was necessarily going to be something improvised. And this improvisation definitely extends to the use of languages. Now, is that a claim I'm going to sustain when we start talking about literary writing? Improvisation and chiseling. Scaffolding. No one would want improvised scaffolding. Probably not improvised chiseling either. And inevitably in literary endeavour, there is evidence of craft. So you need to think about that opposition, or perhaps that contradiction again between the craft and the improvisation, the unknowingness, I think, which is, for me in any case, part of this process. But before we start making that claim and bringing in too many metaphors and complicating the claim, let me just say that the idea of improvisation in any case matters, because it pushes out any lingering sense that adopting French was about preserving the authenticity of the speech I was hearing. That is, that the adoption of the other language would enable me in some way to get closer to my informant, my native informant. The possibility, which Spivak encapsulates in her reference to Woman Friday, I'll come back to that in a minute, is very much at stake for me. The work I'm doing is about trying to hear what is escaping me in the fabric of the life that I consider mine. And the project of amplifying those voices by extracting them from the multiplicity of expression and requirement, of making them stand at some level on their own terms by putting them in a text, that possibility has a lot of pull. And I worry frequently that it exerts that pull through a sort of tokenism, with glancing extracts that are being asked to do the work of presence, supplemented by italics as a sign perhaps of my wariness, like I'm only just holding them. And interestingly, I think that intersects with the text that you quoted earlier from Italian, where the Somalian is given in italics. So, you know, that question of how it sits on the page, these are complicated questions. So this is a small text that comes, which is written quite recently with a number of other people from Ethiopia, Guinea-Conakry and Sudan. My writing's in French. Their words were spoken, in fact, if you like, in situations that happened in the world, in English and in French and in Arabic. The text is obviously essentially in English and French. And I definitely see a danger here that would be a form of ventriloquizing the native other. And this is a danger that Spivak that stages, in fact, in her discussion in that same text I quoted from earlier, when she works on Coetzee's writing, J.M. Coetzee's writing, Faux, where she investigates the possibility that this is, that there's a ventriloquizing again of Friday, okay? And she talks about Coetzee's writing as writing with Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. So, a danger. But I think ultimately that there is no sustained claim in this writing to authenticity. What there is instead is sporadic interjections from very different provenances. I'm not going to bother quoting it and reading it and so on. There are just bits of it which are, assertive, bits of it which are erudite, bits of it which are knowing, bits of it which are evasive. And I think that kind of assertive and erudition and so on and evasiveness crosses the different languages, in fact. That's not what is distinguishing the two different, ostensibly evident different languages. So that this kind of French text written by a native English speaker, it doesn't sit easily across the distinction between, if you like, authority and other subaltern status. Instead, perhaps what is happening, the metaphor that makes sense for me, is to, and I have to unfortunately say here that it's impossible for me to talk about this as ongoing work without saying this is what I want to be happening as well. Whether it is or not is another question, is a staking out of a map. Okay, I think the question of the spatialization is going to become interesting and will, I hope, intersect with what Godela said earlier. It's a map, though, that doesn't hold together. It's a map for a field of work that is a broken and uneven place. This particular text is part of a project which is in press currently, which continues to work with a small contingent set of names, of place names, in fact. And these place names they don't matter for any other reason than that the vagaries of state administration has made them for individuals places of attachment. So there's something there again about the fact of choosing, of having to stake something in a name, in a place, and there's no reason for that being, there's no rationale for that, it just is the case that that's the place that concerns you. And in the same way, and interestingly, so the idea of building a map at some level from that as a means of resisting the map that is in fact the regular map, the map of Europe, which is an instrument of exclusion, and we might even say an instrument of war. So just to give you an example, because it is one of the points of intersection where Polanja is made to signify something completely different. In one of the texts, in this book, the word Versailles, the French site of the Ancien Régime and of Louis XIV, and today one of the main administrative centres where people have to go to register their claim for asylum, it gets unpacked because actually what it means originally is vers alia, vers là-bas, over there. So this centre becomes this space of aspiration that's just an over there that you can't quite name. And so it's doing something similar in that respect, which is, an interesting coincidence. Now, but to step back a little and to sort of look perhaps at what is closer to the field of translingual writing as we've been approaching it today, to come back to a space, a moment where perhaps Spivak's Woman Friday looms particularly large for me as well, where the possibility of trying to think about the other woman, in this instance a much older woman, a French woman, a woman who lived through the war, and who in all sorts of ways is I could properly construe her as a native informant from whom I've learned a huge amount. And she's part of this book. And in fact, she's largely the main instigator of this book. And the short passage that I want to talk about briefly, in order to bring us back to questions of women's writing and questions as well of what might happen in a properly literary endeavour to write translingually. It's the passage where she and I as a narrator in the text, are discussing old copies of a magazine that appeared very briefly in the immediate aftermath of the war. The magazine is called La Femme. Sorry, I'm moving the wrong thing here. Okay, so this is an extract which is quoted in the text, but this is an extract from the magazine itself. Okay, you've got it in English and in French there. So in this extract, this is from one of the very first issues of the magazine. It's printed on very poor paper in the immediate aftermath, and we're talking about still, November 1944. So, the rest of Europe is still at war, but Paris has been liberated, and they start, and the incredible need to start taking control of language in the aftermath of the war is operative here. So, and women, of course, are going to vote for the first time. So one of the reasons for launching this magazine, La Femme, was to kind of celebrate and educate women about taking up their civil right to vote. So in this magazine, printed on poor quality ration paper, there's a feature on Paris that insists on the multiplicity of the city and insists on the endless variety of women in it. And all of this hangs around the word ensemble, meaning both a dress and a matching jacket, a collective housing unit, and ensemble is a big, multi-story housing block, and also quite simply just togetherness. And in the early winter of 1944, in liberated Paris, where people were obviously coming to terms with the consequences of the collaboration, the claim to an ensemble, and more specifically an ensemble of ensembles, sorry, I've got a typo there, Paris est un ensemble d'ensemble, or Paris is a collection of ensembles. That's obviously a hugely significant and difficult claim to be making. Now, this ensemble d'ensemble, we could translate it in all sorts of ways. We could translate it as a holding together of our differences, but we could also translate it as a collection of dresses. Now, obviously, I haven't chosen to translate it here on the PowerPoint, and partly because I think what matters to me in that sentence is the poise of its indeterminacy. Okay, that poise of the word there enables the indeterminacy of its meaning. Now, from this find, which was a genuine find in a magazine, which itself stages what women say, as you can see there, it says, it's an ensemble, as women might say, okay? The text, my text, continues to double that staging, narrating in free indirect speech, the attempt to sound out this other character, this old woman, my native informant, to sound her out about this newspaper spread. A newspaper spread that she received for the first time at a time in her life when her husband had disappeared, perhaps deported to Germany, perhaps in the resistance network somewhere, of her life nearly 70 years earlier, sitting at the same kitchen table in the same room where she initially unfolded this magazine, in a small street that's just around the corner from where I live. So the text goes on. I'll read it in French. J'avais le sentiment d'avoir trouvé ce qu'on guettait depuis le début de l'après-midi, sans avoir distinctement formulé que nous cherchions quelque chose. C'est une parole de femme, vous ne pensez pas, et j'hasardai, sachant d'avance qu'elle ne me répondrait pas ou à peine. Elle s'est contentée de regarder ailleurs. Je ne renonçais pas pour autant à l'impression qu'elle s'attendait de ma part à quelque élaboration. So this sentence, c'est une parole de femme. So I've translated it's what a woman would say, don't you think? But I could also translate it as it's a woman writing, don't you think? Those are woman's words, don't you think? Right? So there are all sorts of possibilities there. C'est une parole de femme. So I think in that sense, my text is doubling this indeterminacy that I hear in this word ensemble in the original text. Okay, so the indeterminacy of the sentence creates a proliferation of possibility that is perhaps registered in the text, and I suppose that's what I'm claiming by translating it here. And in the original writing, I'm afraid, slightly, I don't know, I didn't resist the fact of making that possible proliferation or the sort of amplification that I'd given this phrase. You know, I felt I needed to address that in the text. So the text continues to reflect, it goes on to reflect on the possibility of the danger of grandiloquence or banality as soon as the sentence gets framed in that way. So as soon as we kind of latch onto it, c'est une parole de femme, then, you know, what do? We ask that sentence to mean a lot of things, and at the same time it sort of potentially just slips away from us. And that's kind of where what the text starts to, I suppose something like the word perdu might also be doing that. You could, you know, suddenly the immensity of what's at stake in ordinary language taking on a resonance that's unexpected, but then at the same time it's always just going to disappear as well if you wait too long with it. So all of these things are the this, I suppose, is where you know, this moment, if you like, is where I'm then going to go towards the need to bring her words in. Okay, so these are the words which are attributed to there. Okay, so from that moment of worrying about attributing meaning and over-egging my words, over-egging these words, let's say, right? Which I suppose, if I just kind of think a little bit further about that, I think there's a sort of anxious stalemate in those two oppositions, right? Either I'm invoking the native informant, I'm saying that, you know, asking her to kind of confirm, or I'm in some way kind of, you know, labouring the idea that there's wisdom there that needs to be heard, okay? So it moves on, and it stages her actual words. And those actual words go, pour ce qui est dansant, vous savez, à cette époque-là, on faisait avec ce qu'on trouvait. Sa voix me fait comprendre qu'elle a suivi chaque méandre de mon doute. C'est vrai qu'on avait tous envie de changer d'habit, et les filles ne demandaient pas plus que de se faire de nouvelles tenues. Mais pour trouver le tissu, on utilisait ce qu'on avait sous la main. Alors il fallait voir les robes qu'on se faisait. On ne manquait pas d'imagination. Now, you can all read it in English anyway. Now, does it matter that I have no recollection that she ever said this? That this afternoon, sitting in a dining room where I did sit and which does exist, never happened like this? No, I don't think so. For the objective is not one of adequation, of arriving in her speech, but one of composition, of deciding to write with what I was able to hear in a relation that I hope is closer to complicity or even comradeship than it is to appropriation of a language, hers, or absorption in a culture, again, hers. And that comradeship extends in a sort of continuity, I want to say, between the found text, the actual conversations, and the imagined exchange in a written form. Now, just as in the more recent project, the importance of familiar place names such as Versailles slide across the possibilities of etymologies anchored in other languages like Old French or Latin, towards contemporary deformations, so that Versailles can start to signify Versailles, again, because of the way it is pronounced today. Now, you know, that's I think, that's the reshaping that I see as being the work of the arrivant, and that is necessary to imagine language as language on the move. Now, are these strategies that I've described specific? Does it make sense to me to define them as distinctive to translingual writing? Well, actually, at the end of this afternoon, a little bit more. Is this attention to language specific to translingual writers? I'm going to conclude by saying that I think it's writing that operates from within its uncertainty, and perhaps sometimes overstates that uncertainty, and that itself is part of the uncertainty, but still thinks that one way, perhaps the best way, again, marked by uncertainty, of edging towards this living that it wants to know is to wrap it with words. Thank you.